Hello and welcome to MySecurity TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Friday morning episode. And we've got a space special this morning. We're going to be joined by Andy Bowyer, the CEO with Kleos Space, looking at their Polar Vigilance mission, and we'll have a look at their Q2 21 results and updates. Kleos Space, if you didn't know, is an ASX-listed company and also listed on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. And Andy is joining us from, I think he said Maryland in the US. So he's on the east coast of the US, near DC. And then we're going to be joined once again by Dr Chris Flaherty from Space Warfare Analysis Lab. And we're going to be looking at the space tourism sector. We've had a couple of billionaires head up into space very recently. You would have heard that in the mainstream media. But we'll have a look at where the space sector and the space tourism sector is actually going. And hopefully these two will segue very nicely just in looking at the space industry as we do. And if you're not aware, we have our space and defense.io channel where we cover off on space. As we do on MySecTV, we cover off on aerospace and space, defense and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We will be streaming on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and hopefully everything's working this morning. We'll go for the full hour, no doubt, today, and one of these might be released out as a podcast also. But otherwise, welcome to head to the MySecurity Marketplace and have a look at all of our previous interviews. Just to follow up on what we did on Tuesday, we were joined by IBM Security, Chris Hockings, their Chief Technology Officer, looking at the IBM cost of a cyber breach or data breach report. And again, that is also out and will be coming out as a podcast. And then really wanted to highlight next Tuesday, we have a panel session with our Chief Information Security Officer, Alex Lazal, who is the Head of Security with Flybys. And this is in partnership with ForcePoint, and we'll also be joined by Nick Savides, their Senior Director of Strategic Business. So if you're part of or looking at a security transformation project or even done one, no doubt this one will be of interest as a good case study. And then also on the 26th of August, government and private sector cybersecurity protection for critical infrastructure. That's one is with Clarity. And then coming up, just as a bit of a taste of what we've got coming up, also have ECADA, and we're looking at preventing fraud in the digital world with early and accurate detection. And also with ECADA, this is a webinar, Niall Wellen, the Principal Field Data Scientist for the Asia Pacific, looking at fraud prevention with a focus on customer experience as well. Just as a update, we've just interviewed Lynette Tan, the Chief Executive with Singapore Space and Technology, looking at the space sector in Asia. Very good one, and again, relates to today's session on space. And Lynette gives a good insight in terms of Singapore's sort of role in Asia and in the space sector there. And also wanting to highlight our MySmart TV with Jess Bainbridge. And she's got about 2 or 3 interviews out. This is our new channel. And we'll also be sort of launching a Best in Tech awards later in the year as well. So please do check that one out. And also for the Southeast Asia region, we have the Top Women in Security. This will be on the 31st of August, our awards ceremony, where we'll be announcing the top 30 women in the region, and also with our 27 partners, both industry partners and media partners. And we've just dropped our latest edition of the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine. Headline there, the ransomware war, that's available on the Issue platform, but also on the marketplace. And also coming up, we've got the Australian Cybersecurity magazine. So these will be sort of a brother-sister type relationship on cyber risk. This is one a little bit more global, and then we have the Australian version. Thank you very much to RSA and the Secure ID suite there for our sponsorship. And if you want to check out anything else or support the channel, please go to the mysectv.shop and check out the merchandise. That's enough from me on the MySecurity Marketplace. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on Andy Bowyer, CEO of Kleos Space. Andy, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Chris, great to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
Great. And it's great to have you back, mate. It's been, I think, late last year we had you on. And yeah, I think, and you hadn't really, I was going to say, and we had a really good pre-interview, and sorry to the audience, you weren't involved. We had a really very good pre-interview chat. So hopefully I can sort of capture much of what we talked about there. But maybe introduce us to Kleos Space, and as an update, You've now got 2 clusters of satellites launched, and you're now looking into your 3rd cluster. And so, yeah, maybe talk us into 2021 and how it's been, and Kleos Space as a business as well. And welcome for you to start where it suits.
Thank you. I'll give it a very quick intro. So, Kleos Space is a defense company. We're using satellites flying in space to collect information about what's happening around the world, in particular around where there is radioactivity. Why that's important to our customers is people want to know where humans are, where human activity is. And by tracking communication activity, whether it's through walkie-talkies or mobile phones or sat phones and what have you, you start to get an indication as to where there's human activity. Where that becomes interesting is where you weren't expecting it to be, near your coastlines or near your borders or near ships that you're needing to protect, near assets that need to protect. So starting to look at lots and lots of different applications. We work in many different verticals, but the important thing is that our satellites are collecting data. We're providing that data as a service to our customers. Basically, they access a database with some data in it. They pay a subscription. They have a license to access a little bit or a lot, depending on how much they pay. And that's the model. So the business model is quite similar to software as a service, but it's a data set. We own and operate our own satellites, so we own the infrastructure, and we sell our data either direct to integrators, to analysts, or we sell through resellers who look after individual marketplaces. And we've got some fantastic resellers all around the world. So yeah, it's a very, very quick intro.
I was going to say, sorry, and maybe that business model we mentioned is very similar to the satellite imagery services as well, but now you've got sort of RF frequency and detection data as well, just selling the raw data.
Right. So the whole world that we work in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is all about layering data sets. Getting an idea as to where there's communication, where there's radioactivity, that's where we sit in there. But layering into that is the imagery guys, synthetic capture radar imagery, optical imagery, AEST, weather, etc. And all of that information comes in. It's called activity-based intelligence. And our data is really sold very similar to imagery by square kilometer or million square kilometers, as the case may be in our case. So we launched our first cluster in November last year. There are scouting mission, our demonstrators, the ones that are working through all of the space systems, getting the whole thing operational. We're the first company in the world to fly clusters of 4 satellites in formation, really close together. So there's like a diamond that work in 2 pairs that fly amongst each other as they're going around the orbit. It's incredibly complex, but by doing that, we get a very accurate location of those radio transmitters on the ground. So it's quite unique. But the scouting mission satellites are now they're working or fully functional, delivering data down to the ground. That gets processed by our algorithms and gets sent to the customer. Our second cluster that was launched just a few weeks ago is it's already twice as powerful as the first one.
Right.
The tech is just exploding in terms of capability in space. It's a great time to be working in the industry because we can get more and more and more out of each asset that we're launching. So our second cluster are going through the commissioning phase, and we're currently building our third cluster. Why we need more than one set of satellites is the more that we see the same place on Earth, the more data we can collect, and that data becomes more valuable to the customer. I was using the example a little bit earlier on in terms of it's similar to financial data, that if you had a data point once a day for a particular stock, it's interesting and it's fine, but if you could get that data point 20 times a day, 50 times a day, and you could get it more, nearer real time, it becomes much more valuable to you. Not just 50 times more valuable, but actually exponentially more valuable. And that's exactly the same in our data set. So that's where we are.
Well, I was going to say, do you still compete with other satellites up there that might have radio frequency tracking, or is it you're very focused on your market and who you're collecting the data for, and therefore it is more valuable? Because again, you're about to have all your clusters. That the 3 was the main one, isn't it? So by the end of this year, all your clusters will be done.
No,
and you're in business, or you want more?
we will plan to launch more clusters as we grow as a business over the next 12 to 24 months. Because literally, the more data, the more satellites we have, the more data we can collect, the more data we have to sell. We're selling our data based on million square kilometers collect per hour. So we have a time associated with that. The more volume of data you have, the more valuable it is to the customer, and our subscription rates go up and up.
Got it.
So it's just a volume issue. So
I've got a recollection to how many clusters you might be doing. What is the ballpark number of clusters? Is it 50 or 60? Is it that many?
The very maximum you would ever launch is be 20.
20.
And the reason
okay.
why that is because if you were to launch 21, you don't get any benefit above your 20th.
So enough to cover the globe, right?
It goes up over a curve, basically.
Got it.
So what we believe the sweet spot is probably 8 to 12, but this is about reacting to customer demand. If the customer's demanding more and more data more often, and they're paying for it, we've got the ROI, the IRRs on our capex. We'll keep launching satellites and reacting to that customer demand. That's another good thing about this type of space industry and the way the space industry's gone is that, under a year, we can be changing, reacting to new customer demand, new customer requirements, launching new satellites, and delivering more capability to, either the military user, the warfighter, or the commercial customer.
Now, there's different ways to go. From the business perspective, you're listed on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and also the Australian Security Stock Exchange. You've been growing your team there in the US as well. You're in the US also. And then we talked about that second cluster that just went up. That's the Polar Vigilance satellites. They're at a 500, 600 kilometer Sun Synchronous orbit aboard, and they went up on the SpaceX Transporter-2. So maybe let's talk about the clusters and how the industry, how you engage with setting up these launches and getting a satellite into space. Excuse me. As a sort of a public company or as a private company, as you do, how have you found the process? Are you finding it's getting easier now? And how tightly do you hold that desk when the launch is happening? Because the Transporter-2 got delayed a couple of times, and you're like, oh my god.
Yeah, it's easier than it used to be. I worked in the space sector for a long time, and a lot of my colleagues in the company have done. We've got a lot of experience in this sector, and take for instance, we worked on a mission to go to Mercury called Bepi Colombo that was delayed 7 years at the launch site. So that's sort of like old space. It kind of where things were. That's a bit of an extreme example, but things can get delayed. But it was kind of normal. People would expect a year delay for things, for things being launched. And I think the thing that's changed that really SpaceX have spearheaded is getting much more reliable launches and them launching on time. Give it take a week or two. It's never going to be on the minute you decide a year earlier, but give it take a week or two. They're launching pretty accurately. When they say they're going to go, they're going to go. And that is almost more important than the price of the launch, because as a business, you can't make money. We can't generate money until the satellites are in space. It's impossible for us to do that. So it's absolutely imperative that they get launched on time and reliably. And I think that's really where SpaceX have done a fantastic job. I mean, the prices have come down a lot. SpaceX advertised their pricing. It's way below where we were just even 3-4 years ago. And that was half the price it was 5 years ago. It's really coming down. My sense is that it's probably plateauing. I don't think there's a lot more to come out of it, because there's only a limited number of customers. There's not infinite customers, and you still have a basic cost of launch, the fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we are where we are. Just to go, how we contract that. We work through a launch broker. We work through a company called Spaceflight. They're in Seattle in the US, and they basically broker launches for your satellites on all sorts of different launch vehicles. And
Yeah.
why we use something like spaceflight rather than going direct to SpaceX is that if we were to have a problem, or SpaceX to have a problem, we can switch our launch provider and give us more flexibility. So they kind of broker these great pricing structures, give you the ability to pay a little bit less than you would do direct. And so we work through partners like that.
And you also have to go to different providers or launch providers as well, based on the orbit you're looking for. Because I think the first one went up on your scouting mission went up on an Indian or from an Indian launch.
That's right. So the depending on where the launch is coming from, you have limited options with regard which orbit you're going into. And because we are always rideshare, our satellites are quite small.
Yeah.
We're not spending the 40, 50 million on to be the prime contractor on a launcher. We're always the bit on the side, paying a little bit. Those guys are defining where the launch goes to, and so you're a little bit restricted by that sort of thing. But it just means that as you build out your constellation, i.e. the multiples of clusters, you can plug holes in that constellation in different ways, and we track all of that, what's going on, as you'd imagine.
Yeah, and I take it, how long are these satellites going to last for? I imagine, because this is we talked about maybe up to 20 clusters, you might have a sweet spot of 12.
Yeah.
I take it over time, you'll have a work program where those satellites may return down and you put new ones up. So
yeah,
this
that's
is
right.
an ongoing thing.
There's some positives to that. So we have a mission life of about 5 years, a design life, that is. And that works out quite nicely in the model, because it means that you've got 5 years of amortization and booking revenues against that particular asset, that particular capex asset. However, it does also mean that there's a natural refresh, because the tech is moving so fast in terms of advances. You want really the latest and greatest up there, otherwise you'll end up in a position where you're getting overtaken, or so really it forces you to always be on top of the latest technology, and it makes it quite dynamic in that sense, which is it's a lot of fun, but it also keeps you really at the bleeding edge of technology.
If I can, maybe slightly off topic, but how do you bring those satellites back? I take it it's all part of the way space is kind of regulated now. They come back safely. There's no space junk down there. They do return.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, there isn't actually a law which makes you do that, which is quite surprising. However, we're a responsible space operator. So what that means is that you actively deorbit your satellites to the point where they demise within the Earth's atmosphere. So we, to all intents and purposes, when they've come to the end of their useful life, we use the propulsion on board, because they've got lots of propulsion on, use the propulsion on board to deorbit them past the ISS orbit,
height,
bring them down to 100 kilometers or something like that. They then, gravity pulls them down within a couple of months, basically, at that point, and then they burn up into the Earth's atmosphere quite safely and environmentally safely, etc.
Nice.
So they're we basically remove them from orbit, and that's much more the way that things are working in low Earth orbit these days. You're filling it up, but you're refreshing all the time and clearing the orbit. So it does help. There's still debris up there, which is a challenge, like very old debris at times from previous issues with satellites. So there's always you have to track all of that debris. We have all sorts of programming in place in order to track that. And if the things are too close, we can perform maneuvers to move out of the way. That's another reason.
I think that's another key aspect of your clusters. You can move them. So particularly even for client requirements, you can adjust them. And that was one of the questions I had is how have things adapted now? You've got your clusters up, or a couple up there, and how much has the business changed or adaptation that you've needed as a result, now that you're in kind of operation? How much change have you needed to make?
I don't think we were far off with what we thought the customer was going to want. We understand the areas of interest that people want to see, because they're the kind of obvious ones around the world, where there is a threat, or where there's issues with overseas interests. I think, things like we've got some fantastic people involved in the business, particularly on the sort of, front-facing, government customer-facing route with, Pete Brown, Karen Hayes-Ryan, and we've got these incredible characters who are touching our customer friend, and they're touching that market all the time because they've been in the domain. So that's really helped us predefine those requirements. I think the thing that we have really noticed is there's been no let up in excitement, and actually we're even finding new applications that customers are interested in the data that we didn't even dream of. There is, there was an example the other day that somebody was talking about a challenge they've got with illegal mining in the middle of jungles, etc. People are setting up a mining camp to mine something illegally, and they're coordinating all of that through radios because it's short range, gives them the ability to be safe. It's all hidden. It's very hard to see from space from an imagery perspective. And if we can say, hold on, there's some radio activity in the middle of the jungle there that you weren't expecting to see, we don't know if it's mining or not because all we know is there's some human activity. They then can queue an image, go and send a plane, go and investigate it further. That's fantastic.
And I take it like illegal forestry would be another one, illegal forestry as well, I imagine. And also,
exactly.
Anything remote.
Exactly that. So anything where there is, very remote areas where people think they can do whatever they want and are getting away with illegal activity, whether it's, the sort of drug cartels are operating their own cell phone networks. Well, if you can detect cell phone towers where they shouldn't be, then that's interesting to the intelligence community. And that's, I think, the fascinating thing is that the depth of application is beyond what we originally thought, which was probably quite narrow in its field. So that means the more applications, the more subscribers there are, and that's something we're encouraging.
It's a good thing, even if you had a narrow view, but you still had the business case. So obviously to find more applications is also good from that business case. Now, maybe let's have a look at the Q2 update. You've been signing on. One thing you'll find, and I better disclose I'm a shareholder in Kleos as well. It's not I don't own the farmhouse on it, but enough to keep me interested in what you're doing. And it has been performing quite well. And obviously, following your second cluster being launched, you're now moving in. But you've also got new appointments. You mentioned a few names there as well, particularly as head of sales, deals in Japan, South America. How's all that coming through? What's your kind of pipeline and business process to engage with customers early, and you're able to provide data now as well, right?
Yeah, so we've got one of the things we're quite proud of is the pipeline is very, very strong. So we've got about 170 in the pipeline of companies and agreements or people, organizations that we've engaged. We're working through either getting them through into a signed contract position or in discussions to get to that point. So it's a pipeline, and we're working. Really, the whole objective at the moment is to convert that pipeline into backlog, and that's the mission of the sales team, if you like, is to convert pipeline to backlog. Brilliant, and start reporting against backlog instead of just pipeline. Of that pipeline, though, I think what's one of the real strengths of it is its diversity. So, for instance, there's about 70 in there which are government customers, direct government customers, and about 100 that are commercial customers. So we've got some spread there. We're not reliant on one or two government agencies for one or two defense contracts. We've got a big spread there in terms of managing risk. We've also got a diversity across different geographic areas. So it means that we're less reliant on just the USA. We've got about 30% of our business is US at the moment. 30% Europe, 30% South America, Latin America, and the rest is kind of Asia Pacific at this moment in time. So we've got a fantastically diverse geography with regard to that pipeline as well, and that again de-risks the pipeline because it means we're not reliant on our local government to just give us a big contract to survive. This is a numbers game. We've got to build subscriber numbers, tap into the addressable market, and grow that subscriber base. from the early stage revenues, we're trying to bring people in at a relatively low level from a subscription level perspective and grow them over the next 12 to 18 months. Come with us on the journey as
I was
we
going to
have more
say,
and more data, get them kind of addicted to the data, get them hooked, because once you've got a data set that you trust, it's very sticky. You don't want to chop and change data sets because you're reliant on it from an intelligence perspective. And I think that's a really critical thing, because if you're having to chop and change data, you go back to only having to data.
You have no pattern or life cycle on that. Yeah.
You don't know what happened last year, because as soon as you stop subscribing to our data, you don't have access to it anymore. So it's gone, and you have no right to use it anymore. Nobody owns the data set apart from us.
Got it. So it's in a repository, is it, where they have to access it? It's not like you give it to them and then they go off and.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Well, that's a good business
basically,
model.
they access the database or the data lake.
Got it.
Fashionable way of putting it. And via an API, and you drag out the information you need at that particular time. But the license, the license key that you have is the legal document that allows you to use that data. As soon as you stop paying for that, there's no license associated with it anymore. You can't use it anymore. You can't access it. It's gone. So that's why it's very sticky in that sense. But that's why we're quite careful with pricing, and we make sure that we're getting people in and using it, and we're supporting them and building that network of analysts up and making sure they trust us and they'll work with us. And this is a long game in that sense. It's about building trust and relationships in this industry, and the defense sector is all about that trust.
Well, one of the things I wanted to at least cover, you being an ASX listed company, we've been looking at the Australian space sector for a while as well. Do you have Australian customers? Have you been getting support from the Australian space sector?
Yeah, so we have a channel partner, as we call them in Australia, called SIPAC. Right. Fantastic defense and security company. They basically support our direct Australian customers there in the DoD.
So they resell?
So, yeah, but it's a bit more than just resell. They have the technical capability to integrate and support the customer base.
Got it. Okay.
So that was I think really important for particularly this day and age where there's no traveling. I couldn't get into Australia.
We were in lockdown too, mate. So yeah.
Well, that's the reason why I can't get in. So there's you need those trusted partners, and also we then are leveraging their relationship with the customer that already exists, and that speeds up the route to market. It speeds things up in terms of we don't have to wait a year to bid for a big contract. They're already working in those contracts,
and monitoring the market for you too.
Yeah, so we have to give up some margin, of course we do, in exchange for that. But that is that you can price these things in, and that's the right way to do it.
Well, that's one of the key challenges, isn't it? When you're dealing globally, you've got to scale. So you've got to scale everything that you do from a business. Maybe let's finish off with where you see the industry going. Again, you're a quarter of a way through maybe your pipeline of clusters and the like. What time frame do you look at that? And then also the way we talked about convergence in pre-interview as well, where potentially you got imagery, now you got RF, and you've got other sort of satellites up there doing different jobs, and how there might be a bit of convergence in the sector. Yeah, what's your pipeline or sort of time frame for getting the rest of the clusters up? What's 2022 looking like, so to speak? And then thoughts on the industry as a whole.
There's a couple of ways of looking at that, and I think the best way of answering it is we are tracking our constellation growth based on customer demand.
Yeah.
So and adoption, because there's a difference oftentimes the demand you get from a customer and their adoption rate, and how long it takes for them to turn into a revenue generating customer from them being very excited. So how long that adoption rate takes, we will tune our constellation and CapEx spend to match where the adoption sits, and we're able to do that. But it's roughly, we could have everything launched by the end of 2022. physically, but there's no point in doing that just yet. We will ramp it up a little bit slower than that over the next 12 to 24 months, basically.
So you're going to bed down the current clusters. You got nothing planned for 2022, because how far do you have to sort of schedule if you want to put a cluster?
You really need a year. So yeah, we are certainly working on designs for 2022. Right. Absolutely. We have a chief innovation officer that's looking at not just the near-term capabilities, but he's horizon scanning for what's being invented next that we can leverage.
Because it might be worth waiting. Yeah, it might be worth waiting 6 months for some new tech, right? Yeah.
Capability might double next year because of a new piece of tech. So we're working, we're horizon scanning, scouting for those new pieces of technology, and they'll be deployed when it's appropriate to do so. So yes, we're absolutely working on next year's technologies and clusters and capability, because we're getting customer requirements for 22 and 23. Yeah. We understand what's going to be needed. So I think in terms of the marketplace, the way you look at Earth observation or intelligence collection from commercial satellites, if you'd rather, it breaks down in these silos based on the part of the frequency that you're looking at. So in our case, we have this very sort of specific, we have to fly clusters in order to geolocate. We're looking at RF radio transmissions, very specific in the vertical defense security, really. That complements AIS providers that are collecting AIS data. So that's emanating from ships, or ADS-B from planes. So tracking systems, we're finding the things that aren't being tracked. Tracking systems finding things that are being tracked. Those two things naturally come together really nicely. Then you start to bring in confirmatory pieces of information like imagery. What is actually happening there? If we can find the needle in the haystack and say, go and take a photo here, tell us what's going on, that data, that imagery data, becomes much quicker to look at, because our data is structured. It's points on a map.
And you can beat, and I take it because it's radio frequency, you can beat the imagery. You're faster. We talked about latency before, making sure that there's no latency in the data sets coming through. I take it you're a faster data set too, potentially,
in the sense that because we're delivering a structured data, we're giving people a geospatial data point.
Yeah.
Imagery is unstructured because it is a photo. So you're looking at when you get that photo. We're telling you what to look at because we're giving you a point on the map. If you can match that point on a map with an image, you turn the unstructured data into structured data. That's what the analyst wants. He wants to know where to look. If you speed that whole thing up, that's our value proposition. That's how we sell the data to the analyst. So you've then got these silos of different imagery: optical, which is normal photos, and synthetic capture radar imagery, which is more like the gray pictures you see that see through clouds, but they're very, very high resolution, but very big data sets. They need tipping and queuing from other data sets. And then you also have weather that sits alongside that, because weather affects human activity massively, because the drug runners are moving from South America over to the west coast of Africa to bring drugs up into Europe. They're only moving when the weather's good. They're not traveling through hurricanes and what have you. So the weather is super important into that. So you bring all these data sets together, you start to look at the marketplace, the industry, and I think it's ripe for consolidation, that you've got different sensor suites, that if you can start to bring those together into a single capability, that's very, very powerful for a customer, rather than them being individual suppliers. I think there's some really interesting things to look at in the next 12 to 24 months. Right?
Very much, and also quite troubling for transnational organised crime too. They must be thinking, okay, we're going to potentially have to adapt or be moving a lot faster with people on our ass.
People will always try and obfuscate. They'll always try and perform crime because they make money.
But they still need to communicate.
But they still need to communicate. They still need to move things around. They still need to know where other people are, and it's really, and also they also run different systems to make sure they don't run into stuff, because they don't want to crash.
Of course.
There's all sorts of different radio activity that goes on with illegal or illicit activity, and that makes it quite interesting. And it's very, very hard. I mean, it's very hard for a professional Navy to go radio dark, because they need radios to all sorts of things. But you can imagine an unprofessional sort of illegal activity. It's very difficult.
Well, look, the other one, you've also started a podcast TV kind of update as well, I've noticed. So,
yeah,
what's maybe what's a call to action for anyone watching or interested in this as well? And they can obviously get involved on the share market. But yeah, you've got a communication strategy now. You've got to keep there's so much happening.
We've got a fantastic communication manager who's come in relatively recently. She's brought a whole load of energy and ideas into it. And the objective of this Insight series was to kind of get behind the scenes a little bit, to the way that we're going about business, getting people to understand how the systems work, how the satellites work. So we had the first one was the Chief Technology Officer, Vinny, being interviewed by somebody internal, one of our sales execs. And it would make for a really, I loved watching it. I thought it was fantastic because I really, they're both amazing guys, and I love them both. But getting them together it was fun, and it came across fun. So we're going to try and do them once every month, every 6 weeks, and bring in different parts of the business so that we can explain, okay, well, what's our pricing strategy and how does that work, and what does data as a service really mean, and just trying to get people understanding what makes the business tick a little bit more, so that rather than just me talking all the time, because people are fed up with me talking all the time, how do you get other people involved? And I think that's really it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, and that's what we try to do on here as well, Andy. You can see we've gone over time slightly anyway, and it's hard to talk about a company like Kleos in half an hour with so much going on. So we really do appreciate your time. We'll have you on again for sure. We'll just keep monitoring this over time. It's a long story to be told, and also maybe potentially even other members of the team coming on. Always happy to have you on. And Kleos Space, their quarter update was released, their activities update. They've got a whole bunch of people joining their team as well, and quite high caliber people as well. Your hiring strategy looks really good. Great communication strategy, and very, very increasing prominence, I suppose, in the space sector overall as well. So should be very proud.
It's an important industry, and I appreciate your time and thoughts always, and the opportunity to communicate is very welcome. So thanks for everything you do.
Beautiful. Well, look, mate, I'll let you go. It's evening time for you there. Enjoy the rest of your night. Don't drink too much of that iced coffee there. You won't be able to go to sleep. All right. Look, Andy Bowyer, the CEO with Kleos Space. Thank you very much for your time. I'll let you go.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Andy. Cheers.
Yeah, bye.
Very good. And without further ado, and if you happen to be listening, please say good day. Let us know where you're listening from. And if you're interested in this sector, potentially a good time to ask questions, because our next guest and our regular guest analyst, Dr. Chris Flaherty. I'm just getting my slides ready. Here we go. So, sorry, Chris, 1 second.
It's okay.
Dr. Chris Flaherty, how are you?
Not too bad. That was actually really interesting. That was a great interview.
Oh, thank you very much. But I just asked the questions. Andy's obviously very interesting CEO, and sorry we went slightly over time.
I think it's interesting because I think we've talked about this before. One of the major growth industries potentially is actually companies who collect information to package up and sell. Absolutely. And I think we're sort of concentrating on space industry. We're going to be looking at space tourism, but we're concentrating on launching satellites, building the fixed infrastructure, which is going to be crucial. But the issue about, Virgin Orbit is actually in the position now soon will be in a position having a second stage on their rocket, which they launch horizontally from a 747, that'll actually take missions to basically create the opportunities for planetary probes to Mars, Jupiter, Mars and Venus and the satellites. And the interesting thing about that is companies will actually be sending up probes and satellites to other planets in our solar system, because people will be interested in the data from that. and that becomes an entirely new form of business. And it's interesting to see how it operates on our own planet Earth. But it also means just this is probably one of the major growth industries, and I think it's really interesting to keep a close contact on how this is developing.
And it's also I look at it from a business perspective, because the challenge of running a business as well as a public company as Kleos is, there's so many moving parts there. We even in our own business, we term it, we have planets in orbit. You have to have all of those planets aligning at once to make it actually work. And he's got a lot of plates in the air at any one time. So, it's really impressive.
His satellites, are they under the 500 kilogram category?
They are.
Microsatellites?
Yes. They do 4 at a time, I believe. So
that was very interesting, the idea of coordinated movement between the cluster. I think that's
their scouting mission. Yeah, the scouting mission. Well, look, let's have a chat about space tourism and where that's going. Obviously, they had a lot of mainstream media where we had Virgin Galactic and what was the other one?
And Jeff Bezos from Blue Origin.
That's the one, Blue Origin.
Yep.
So unless you're a billionaire, you haven't had a chance to get up into space. But for some of the figures that you're coming out, we're going to have about 300 odd sort of opportunities a year within the next few years.
Yeah, what we're going to be making available from this talk is a 10-page snapshot, if you like, of the space tourism industry, going back to its actual origins back in 1997, 2004, 2001. And we have to actually remember Mr. Dennis Tito, who was actually a millionaire. If you're going to have millions, why do you need billions? And it goes back. I mean, a lot of people seem to forget that the space tourism industry has actually been growing for 20 years now. And there was a hiatus period between 2010 and 2019 due to the end of the space shuttle program and the growing size of missions on the ISS, the International Space Station. But prior to that point, there were about 7 or 8 people that actually already gone and stayed on the space station. NASA has announced again that they'll be allowing private astronauts to go to the space station. That's actually more or less in relation to the Axiom pre-missions in order to start building the Axiom space station. But I think we need to understand that this industry has already generated something in the order of 920 million or 920 million since 2001. And the interesting thing is, if you go back to the early, the original shift back in 1997, 2004, when they originally the issue was how do you detach space from direct government, the necessity for direct government control, because only governments could largely could go into space. They are the only ones who had the resources. Who else was going to do that? And it had to be the extremely wealthy. I think a lot of people actually forgotten that the original debate, the economic debate back in the late 90s, early 2000s, was that it was actually if you were to launch a private space industry, a commercializing space, it would have to actually, that responsibility, if you like, would have to rest with the extremely wealthy who had the resources on the scale of governments in order to start building space missions, in order to start building the craft as well. In fact, Virgin Galactic's origins back in 2004 goes back to a prize that was awarded to the original company that built Spaceship One, being the first commercial company to successfully launch into space and then repeat the process 2 weeks later. So I think one of the things I'd invite people to do is look at this 10-pager, because at the end of it, we have a series of articles I've culled from a number of places looking at some of the key forms of economic analysis, as well as some of the reports to Congress. So
I thought I just put this one up, Chris, in terms of maybe just talk us through. You mentioned Alan Shepard there, 1961. He was up there for 15 minutes. Blue Origin 2021, 3 minutes, and Virgin Galactic didn't quite make it up to the 50 miles.
And then we've got space jumpers, and then we have space perspectives. Yeah, here we are at the blackboard. Essentially, what is happening with the current state of the space tourism industry is essentially replicating the Alan Shepard experience. Alan Shepard was America's first astronaut in space, And his original, if you like, mission on a Redstone rocket was he went up 15 minutes. He was about 116 miles in space. What I think is going to be ultimately happening is that you're looking at an industry that's essentially building around what was the essential experience, the first actual experience of Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard.
Yeah.
That is actually what people will be buying into in terms of getting enthusiastic and interested about space. And where we go from there is a really interesting question because, what does the next iteration? I think people are too focused on the current craft that have gone up, which have proved being human rated. What we need to start thinking about is when do we start launching serious space operations? Because remember, the original economic analyses saw a potential market between 13 to 15,000 people over a 10-year period wanting to buy a ticket to go into space at roughly $200,000 per piece. More recent economic analysis from the 2018s suggests that pool could potentially be 41,000 people. Now, that has a series of consequences in terms of how we understand the growth of the space industry. That particular one there is another variation of this, which is actually stratospheric ballooning, which is a company called Space Perspectives. And we've also got on our Blackboard previously, we had the Space Jumper.
Yeah. So that's an opportunity, is it? You can be a space jumper into the future?
We've had actually there's four major records have been set since the 1950s, early 60s.
Yeah. And
as late as 2014. Well, what I was doing was, if you like, bringing together, because up to now we've had economic analyses of the potentiality of space tourism. What happened with both within a fortnight of each other was first the Virgin Galactic, then Jeff Bezos. Was we saw really all that 20 years finally coming together. Now, interestingly enough, there was a lot of commentary about the idea about the billionaires going into space, but it was actually interesting when you look at it, because 20 years ago, when they were first starting to think about, could we start creating a commercial space market, who else was going to step into the breach? If government wasn't going to fund this, who else would? And this is exactly what we've had really largely playing out the last 20 years. The question becomes, where do we go next? Do we have a situation where we're largely having an exclusive market to potentially to a wealthy pool who can afford this? With volume, does that begin to drop down? But the other question is ultimately, how else do we make use of this technology? And the question also we have to ask ourselves is, currently we're looking at craft Spaceship 2 and New Shepard. We don't know how these technologies will progress over the next decade as these services become more routine. And I think that's the most important aspect of this, of understanding the industry. And it's in its beginning stages. I mean, interestingly enough, one of the pressing issues is, you asked earlier with when you're looking at that. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The guy previously interviewing and talking about space junk.
Oh, Andy, yes.
Andy, yes, space junk. And you asked about, and he actually said, there's no actual law about returning space junk.
Yeah.
One of the interesting points is that even in 2020, one of the congressional researchers has noted that there is actually no current regulation or legislation to do with space tourism. So, for example,
there's no limitation, right?
There's no limitation. So, yeah. For example, one of the most interesting things is with the Blue Origin mission was one of the party of four was 18 years old. And the reason why that's actually significant is that if you actually look at the average age of an astronaut, they're about 34 years old. Right. And usually they're a lot older. And we've never actually asked the question, well, how young is it to go into space? So, for example, if nations at the end would look at potentiality of, this translating to Australian circumstances, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, if countries are sort of moving towards creating the space generation, such as, for example, in China, I know it's one of the most recent developments in Shanghai is a mega space center. China also has in the Gobi Desert set up sort of replicating the experience of going to Mars. living in a human habitat, or onto the moon, living in and I think in Beijing actually there's a public facility for looking at what it would be like to be on a space facility on the moon, on a habitat. So essentially that idea, do these sorts of tourism ends up being one of the major ways in which we train people and give people that initial experience of going to space.
Well, it's almost like an Everest type thing, isn't it? Where look at the market for just getting up to Everest, where it's almost so crowded, and they're paying a lot of money. This is a good alternative, and it was one of those terms you talk about, space tourism, but also the adventurism.
The adventure aspect of this, because I think the best way to characterize the industry right now is space tourism, space adventures. And I guess that goes back to, you can have your Alan Shepard experience. You can experience what he experienced in a truncated way. For example, there is a small train. I think with Virgin, both Virgin and Blue Origin will be having short training periods to prepare people to go into space. Hence this led to the entire debate about whether they were astronauts or not. I think in one of the slides I've got there the commercial space wings.
I'll have a look, but just maybe this one, you're looking at $125,000 per seat. This is a relatively new company, Space Perspective, launched June 2020.
Very, very interesting, because what they're looking at is, again, it goes back to the sheer diversity of going to space, edge of space. I think the best way to understand the industry right now is that there are missions which will be going to low Earth orbit, which is one of those at the end of the year, which is the end of this year, which is Inspiration 4, which is actually SpaceX. There is a mission going to stay on the International Space Station. Those are if you like, those are low Earth orbit exercises. We then have exercises going to what is called traditionally, classically, the edge of space, or just over the Kremlin line.
That one there,
which is basically there. Or you have missions that are going well above commercial airlines, because if we go down to the blackboard, notice the yellow line. Commercial aviation is 7.2 miles.
Yeah, and then there's nothing regulation after that.
Well, after that point, what we've got is we have an entirely new set of human activities occurring up to the edge of space and into space, and it's that. And what's so interesting about this is just powering along since this year, but it took 20 years to build up.
Yeah.
So, for example, the idea of a stratospheric balloon going up to 19 miles, that's doable. That's the technology that exists right now. The interesting thing is how do we start to manage, I think from a public policy point of view and an economics point of view, how do we start to manage what could be potentially large numbers of people for the first time going to space? Because on one of the tables, we find out that currently there's over about 180 professional astronauts worldwide, if you look at the various astronaut corps that exist. However, there's only 10 people actually in space right now. 7 on the International Space Station, and 3 on the Chinese space station. For within a fortnight, that population actually sort of increased by 12, between 10 and 12 people. So we actually doubled when Jeff Bezos went up in Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. Sir Branson went up in Virgin Galactic. We actually briefly doubled the number of humans in space.
And what's some of the prices that if people start to expect, do you think? What's some of the prices likely, say, on this one with the Virgin Galactic?
Well, with the Virgin Galactic, what we do know at the moment, and this is actually rather interesting, because when you look at the original economic analyses going back to 2002 and 2018, one of the things they said there was a potential pool of about 15,000 people could potentially go up over a 10-year period. And on one of the tables, I amortized that over that period and said, say figure it's 930 people. The sort of pricing you're looking at is about $250,000 at the moment. But interestingly enough, Virgin Galactic has already a pool of pre-ticket sales, believed to be in around the 600 mark, but they have potential bookings of over 8,000 already. So
at 600,000 each?
No, at about $250,000 per ticket potentially. We don't know. We don't know whether it'll go up. I mean, one of the interesting economic analyses is they see an initial ticket price, a brief rise, and then it beginning to drop off as demand increases and the service becomes more regular, which is a classic economic model, because this is exactly, if you like, this is a space version, the edge of space version of the airline industry.
Yeah.
Now, what I think is interesting about this is that if you look at economic analyses back in the 2000s, thought it would be a pool of 15,000 people. Already we have one company which actually has a tested version, and the illustration we're looking at now is actually Spaceship 2 with its mothership. This is what's called a horizontal launch system. The mothership, which is the craft on either side with a wing, is what takes it to a horizontal, takes it into the upper aerospace area, and then the Spaceship 2 then detaches and then rockets up to edge of space for their space experience. What is interesting about that is that already the current calculation, as Virgin has almost achieved, is actually nearing the 15,000 mark, which the original economic analysts thought would be the case over a 10-year period. So potentially there is actually quite a demand out there. The issue, which we also cover off on this paper, is we then look at some of the other questions that are beginning to arise out of this, such as, for example, one of the debates that almost immediately happened, both in the case of Blue Origin, both Virgin Galactic as well as Blue Origin, when they had the post-media brief, if you like, they awarded themselves company-designed astronaut medals. Now, what was so interesting about this, virtually I think it was in the day of Blue Origin's launch return, the FAA issued refreshed instructions as to who actually qualifies as a commercial astronaut, and they excluded both Bezos and Sir Branson and other people. And that, I think, actually that sort of somewhat got misunderstood. And I think what was really happening there is that if you look at it, there's actually now probably about 3 to several different categories of different types of astronaut we can actually have. There is a government astronaut, as in the NASA astronaut, NASA's famous astronaut corps. There's various national astronauts from Canada, Japan, India, and China. Some of those have their own national forms of identification. China's Tigonauts, India's Guggenauts. Canada and Japan will basically use standard astronaut. We've always thought of an astronaut under international law ever since the 1967 Space Treaty as anyone who goes into space. However, NASA is now talking about commercial astronauts, private astronauts, public astronauts, and space tourists.
Yeah.
So again, actually, and what was happening with why the FAA probably went the direction it did was a concern about the fact as well, how do you therefore identify someone who actually has commercial astronaut wings, which is actually a private or public astronaut who's qualified to do a space mission. And I think that is where it sort of got a bit messy and a bit confused, and people didn't quite understand some of the distinctions the FAA was beginning to set up. Admittedly, it was problematic because they're actually trying to set it up after the event has actually happened. They're almost backfilling the regulations, if you like. And I think it actually reflects again the fact is that the pace of this industry development, the pace of space development is happening so fast. It's classically the problem with all technology, the relationship between technology and law, is technology just speeds ahead. The law is slow to always catch up. And the law is often trying to categorize events that have already happened. And as soon as they categorize something new is created. And therefore the question is, how does the law actually cover that?
Well, look, it's no doubt. I'm just conscious of time, Chris. Look, we will publish this, and it's a fascinating field. Again, the fact that the two kind of owners went up first.
That actually was seen very much as part of a confidence exercise, because if they were prepared to do it themselves.
Yep.
Let's face it.
But it also.
Do you really want to send your CEO into space? Some might, some won't.
Well, I think it also comes to the type of characters that they are as well. They're competitive. They want, it is a good global exposure for them. And as you say, there's no shortage of people who are prepared or with the money prepared to do this. If it can be done safely and without limitation, then it's worthwhile doing. And I think, again, only need to look at, say, the Everest and the adventure type market at the moment. So
And I do want to draw one thing that's important, which is coming out of all of this, is the environmental aspects. Because this is something we really need to start thinking about in terms of, at the moment, space activity is 1% of aviation in terms of pollutants in the air. That's the exhaust from rockets. The problem at the moment, which we need to confront, is that we already have at the commercial aviation level a discernible layer of carbon emissions. It's almost what happens, and this is the environmental issue, which is beginning to become increasingly important, is what happens when we start thinking about 41,000 people going into near Earth or low Earth orbit tours. What is the volume of rocketry that's going to be happening?
Yeah.
For example, we know that commercial satellite launching is going to exponentially expand, because we talked to a number of companies who see literally thousands of satellites being launched in the under 500 category, micro and under 500 category limits. We also see large scale exercises in terms of putting actual stations into space. We know that spaceplane operations will begin shortly. Sierra Nevada Corporation's Dream Chaser. We know that the Chinese are at the moment going to the exercise of building their space station. Axiom Space is soon to start a series of launch missions next year and the next 2 years to begin preparation to build a space station on the back of the ISS. We've just seen the ISS refurbished with a completely new pressurized unit.
Yeah.
We know the Sierra Nevada Corporation is preparing to build its own space station. There is actually almost talk of SpaceX actually building a space station as well.
So I think your point is there's so much activity going on.
What fuels are we going to be burning to send this through our atmosphere?
The environment. Yeah.
What is the impact on the upper stratosphere and the mesosphere?
Yeah, as well as not just the outer atmosphere, but then we've also got our own airline sector going to be kicking off again. You'd expect by about 2024. So that's a lot of activity in the. You hardly be able to see the sun.
Well, there's a possibility. I mean, the thing is about what sort of fuels are we burning? Yeah. We're exhausting into our atmosphere, which actually lead to soot buildups and so forth. And I think the literature is pretty complicated, and it's in its early stages. But I think people really need to, if they're interested in space, this is another area they really need to actually look at, because actual fact, Paul at Black Arrow Space Technologies, Black Arrow, the entire business model of the company is actually environmentally clean.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why we're not only talking about the impact on the surface of the Earth or on the ocean in terms of the launching of a rocket, its exhaust, but what happens with that exhaust going through our atmosphere? What is it depositing in our atmosphere? And that actually is, because at the moment, as I said, it's only 1% of activity. Well, what happens when the scale of activity begins to dramatically swing in favor of space, of going into low Earth orbit and near Earth or edge of space or suborbital, as it's correctly known?
Well, Chris, unfortunately, it sounds like it's a whole episode on its own on that one. So, look, I think definitely we'll flag that one for a potential discussion into the future.
I think that's actually something we need to start looking
more analysis.
There should be environmental scientists we should be bringing in to start talking about this. Because I think it's an issue which actually impacts on the space industry in terms of the future development of engines and what fuels we actually put into those engines.
Very good point.
And the very last thing I want to talk about is we've also got a little one-pager on how space tourism would actually translate in the Australian set of circumstances.
Yep.
And I would invite people to have a look at that and have a look at some of the issues that have been raised out of that. But look, again, we really did we just did our half hour, didn't we?
That's it. And what I'll do is we'll have this up on the website today with a link into this particular interview. But again, there's a lot of here. You did a lot of work here, Chris. So there is a great deal of information. And as you say, keep the audience wanting more. There's also a bit of a takeaway there on Australian space tourism.
I think in October, we're thinking of the exercise in October. I think this is sort of helping us also formulate what sort of topics we should be looking at in October about thinking about the Australian commercial space industry.
Very good.
Where are we going to be taking this?
Good on you. Okay, well, look, Dr. Chris Flaherty, My Space Analysis Lab, thank you so much for today. It's a really good space special. And, we'll have you back on very, very soon.
All right, Chris, have a really great day.
You too,
mate. Happy lockdown.
Happy lockdown. All right, thanks, Chris. I'll put you backstage, mate. Cheers. Very good. Okay, so that's our space special for today, folks. Hopefully you've taken something out of that. And again, let me just tidy these up. And as I do, our report of the day, this one came out from, this is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. And again, this is a threat landscape for supply chain attacks. Slightly off topic from space. I might have thought to look for a space-related report. But again, I just wanted to highlight this one. This was just came out, I think, 2 days ago. 24 supply chain attacks were reported from January 2020 to early July 2021 that have been studied in this report. This is available on the MySecurity Marketplace as a resource. Around 50% of the attacks were attributed and to well-known APT groups by the security community. Around 42% of the analysed attacks have not yet been attributed, so it's still quite high. Around 62% of the attacks on customers took advantage of their trust in their supplier, again, being a supply chain attack. In 62% of the cases, malware was the attack technique employed. And when considering targeted assets, in 66% of the incidents, attackers focused on the supplier's code in order to further compromise targeted customers. And around 58% of the supply chain attacks aimed at gaining access to data, predominantly customer data, including personal data and intellectual property, and around 16% at gaining access to people, which will be those sort of spear phishing access as well. So very comprehensive and in-depth report on that one. And that is the report of the day. And that is us from our Friday morning episode of Tech and Sec Weekly. Have a great weekend here in Sydney and Queensland and Melbourne. Enjoy your lockdown. Stay safe. Get vaccinated. But for the rest of those listening, thank you very much and have a great weekend.